Harold Pemberton had lived at 47 Maple Street for 37 years, and in all that time, he had never encountered a problem he couldn't solve with enough research, planning, and sheer determination. He was a methodical man who approached life like a chess game, always thinking 3 moves ahead. His house was painted every 5 years, his gutters cleaned twice annually, and his driveway power washed each spring without fail. But there was one problem that had been eating away at him for the past 18 months, growing like a cancer in his otherwise orderly existence: Gerald Hutchinson's lawn. Gerald had moved in next door with his wife Marla in January of the previous year, and from the moment the snow melted that first spring, his lawn had been nothing short of spectacular. Not just good, spectacular. The kind of emerald perfection that belonged in magazines or golf courses, not suburban driveways. Each blade stood at precisely the same height, creating a carpet so uniform it seemed almost artificial. The color was a deep, rich green that seemed to glow with an inner light, especially in the early morning when the dew caught the sunlight just right. Harold's own lawn, which he had always considered respectable, now looked like a patchwork quilt of mediocrity by comparison. Brown spots dotted the surface like age marks on an old man's hands. Weeds pushed through in defiant clusters. The grass grew unevenly, creating a choppy, unkempt appearance that made Harold wince every time he pulled into his driveway. The worst part wasn't just the comparison, it was Gerald's commentary. "Morning, Harold," Gerald would call out cheerfully as he emerged for his daily lawn inspection, coffee mug in hand. "Looks like you've got some crabgrass creeping in near your mailbox there. You might want to get on that before it spreads." Or, "Harold, have you considered aerating? Your soil looks pretty compacted from here. That's probably why you're getting those bare patches." Or, most infuriatingly, "You know, Harold, I've got some extra fertilizer if you need it. Might help with that yellowing near your front steps." Gerald delivered these observations with the tone of someone offering helpful advice, but Harold heard something else underneath, a subtle condescension, a barely concealed smugness. Gerald knew his lawn was superior, and he wanted to make sure Harold knew it too. Harold had tried everything. He'd switched fertilizers 4 times, installed a new sprinkler system, reseeded twice, and even hired a professional lawn service for 3 months. Nothing worked. If anything, his lawn seemed to be getting worse, as if it were actively rebelling against his efforts. Meanwhile, Gerald's lawn continued to flourish with seemingly no effort at all. Harold had taken to watching from his kitchen window, trying to decode the secret. Gerald watered sporadically, never seemed to fertilize, and mowed maybe once a week with an old push mower that looked like it belonged in a museum. Yet somehow, impossibly, his grass remained perfect. The breaking point came on a humid Tuesday morning in July. Harold was struggling with his temperamental sprinkler system, which had developed a tendency to spray more water on the sidewalk than the grass, when Gerald appeared at the property line. "Having trouble there, Harold?" Gerald asked, sipping his coffee with an expression of mild concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just a minor adjustment," Harold muttered, wrestling with a stubborn sprinkler head. "You know," Gerald continued, "I've been thinking about your drainage issues. That soggy spot near your driveway? It's probably because your yard slope's wrong. Nothing you can really do about that without major excavation." Harold's hands stilled on the sprinkler. "Drainage issues? Oh yes, it's quite obvious from my kitchen window. The water just pools there after every rain. Creates perfect conditions for fungus and root rot. Shame. Really. Some problems just can't be fixed with effort alone." That evening, Harold sat in his study with his laptop, searching for solutions with the desperate intensity of a man possessed. He'd exhausted all the conventional approaches: fertilizers, seeds, professional services, irrigation systems. If normal methods wouldn't work, Perhaps it was time to consider unconventional ones. His search led him down increasingly obscure rabbit holes. Organic farming forums, permaculture blogs, biodynamic gardening websites that discussed lunar planting cycles and soil energy. And finally, buried deep in a thread on an obscure gardening forum, he found something that made him pause. A user named Earth Whisperer 47 had posted about biological lawn enhancement using specialized organisms. The post was vague, almost cryptic, but it mentioned rare soil amendments that could transform any lawn into a masterpiece through natural biological processes. Harold clicked on the user's profile and found a private message option. After staring at the screen for 10 minutes, he typed a careful inquiry about biological lawn enhancement and hit send. The response came 3 days later. Meet me at Riverside Park, North Parking Lot, Saturday 2 p.m. Bring cash. Harold almost deleted the message. This was exactly the kind of thing his rational mind warned against. Meeting strangers from the internet, cash transactions, vague promises of miracle solutions. But as he looked out his kitchen window at Gerald's impossibly perfect lawn, rationality took a backseat to desperation. Saturday afternoon found Harold sitting in his car in the nearly empty parking lot, feeling like a character in a spy novel. At exactly 2 p.m., a rusted pickup truck pulled up beside him. The driver was a thin man in his 60s with wild gray hair and clothes that looked like they'd been borrowed from a scarecrow. "You Harold?" the man asked through his rolled-down window. Harold nodded. "I'm Eddie. Earth Whisperer 47. You want to see what I've got?" Eddie led Harold to the back of his truck, where a collection of glass containers sat nestled in old towels. Each container was about the size of a mason jar, filled with what looked like ordinary dirt. "This here's the good stuff," Eddie said, lifting one of the jars. "Took me 15 years to cultivate this particular strain. Vermis magnificus, that's what I call it. Magnificent worm." Harold peered at the jar. The soil inside seemed to shimmer slightly, as if it contained flecks of mica or tiny crystals. Worms? Not just any worms. These are special. They process nutrients in ways regular earthworms can't. Create a symbiotic relationship with grass roots that's unlike anything in nature. Your lawn will be the envy of the entire neighborhood. How much? $500 for one jar. That's enough to treat about a quarter acre. Results guaranteed within 30 days, or I'll refund your money. Harold hesitated. $500 for a jar of dirt and worms seemed insane. But then he thought about Gerald's smug smile, his helpful suggestions, his perfect lawn that seemed to mock Harold's failures every single day. "I'll take it." That night, Harold waited until well after midnight before venturing into his backyard with the jar. Eddie's instructions had been simple. Dig small holes every few feet across the lawn, drop in a pinch of the soil mixture, and water thoroughly. The worms would do the rest. The soil felt strange between his fingers. Not quite dirt, not quite sand, with an oddly warm texture that seemed to pulse with subtle life. As he worked his way across the lawn, Harold could swear he saw tiny movements in the mixture, quick flashes of something pale and segmented. By 3 a.m., he had covered the entire front and backyards. He stood on his porch, surveying his work with a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. The lawn looked the same as always, patchy, uneven, disappointing. But according to Eddie, that would change soon. The first sign that something was happening came 4 days later. Harold noticed it during his morning coffee ritual, that daily moment of lawn comparison that had become both habit and torture. His grass looked different. Not dramatically so, but there was a subtle change in color, a slight deepening of the green that hadn't been there before. By the end of the first week, the change was undeniable. Harold's lawn was improving at a rate that defied explanation. The brown patches were filling in with new growth. The weeds were disappearing, not dying but somehow being absorbed or crowded out by increasingly vigorous grass. The color was deepening from pale green to a rich emerald that rivaled Gerald's perfect lawn. Gerald noticed too. Well, he said on the following Tuesday morning, standing at the property line with his coffee mug. Looks like you finally found something that works. What's your secret? Harold felt a surge of satisfaction at the barely concealed surprise in Gerald's voice. Just a new organic approach, he said casually. Sometimes the old methods are the best methods. Organic, huh? Gerald's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied Harold's lawn. Interesting. The growth pattern is quite unusual. Harold followed Gerald's gaze. His neighbor was right. There was something unusual about the way the grass was growing. Instead of the random, chaotic pattern of normal lawn growth, Harold's grass seemed to be developing in subtle geometric patterns, almost like crop circles but much more delicate and complex. Probably just the way the sprinkler system distributes water, Harold said, though he wasn't entirely convinced by his own explanation. By the third week, Harold's lawn had not only matched Gerald's in quality, it had surpassed it. The grass was so perfectly uniform it looked like green velvet. The color was so deep and rich it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Neighbors began stopping during their evening walks to admire it, and Harold found himself giving impromptu tours, basking in the attention and praise. Gerald's commentary stopped entirely. The talk of the neighborhood, but Gerald's silence was more unsettling than his previous criticisms had ever been. Instead of his usual morning commentary, Gerald would simply stand at his kitchen window, watching Harold's yard with an expression that Harold couldn't quite read from a distance. The geometric patterns in the grass were becoming more pronounced. What had started as subtle variations in growth were now clearly visible spirals and interconnected circles that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Harold told himself it was just an optical illusion, a trick of light and shadow, but deep down he knew something extraordinary was happening beneath his feet. It was during the fourth week that Harold first noticed the sounds. He was watering his tomato plants in the backyard when he heard it, a soft, rhythmic rustling that seemed to come from underground. At first he thought it might be his neighbor's sprinkler system or perhaps a water main issue, but the sound was too organic, too alive. It reminded him of the way silk fabric sounds when it's being pulled through fingers, or the whisper of wind through tall grass. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. He found himself standing at his bedroom window, staring down at his lawn in the moonlight. The grass seemed to be moving, not swaying in the breeze but undulating in slow, hypnotic waves that radiated outward from several central points. The geometric patterns were glowing faintly, as if lit from within by some bioluminescent source. Harold rubbed his eyes, convinced he was seeing things. When he looked again, the lawn appeared normal, just grass in moonlight, still and ordinary. But the image of those glowing patterns remained burned in his retinas. The next morning brought a new development that Harold couldn't ignore or rationalize away. Gerald's lawn was dying. It wasn't a gradual decline. It was happening fast, as if some invisible plague was spreading across the once perfect grass. Brown patches appeared overnight, expanding like spilled coffee stains. The edges where Gerald's lawn met Harold's property line showed the starkest contrast. Harold's grass remained lush and impossibly green, while Gerald's withered and yellowed as if it were being drained of life. "Harold!" Gerald's voice carried across the yards, sharp with panic. "Harold, I need to talk to you." Harold found Gerald standing in the middle of his dying lawn, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. His hair was uncombed, his shirt wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. "What did you do?" Gerald demanded. What did you put on your lawn? I told you, it's just an organic treatment. Don't lie to me, Gerald's voice cracked. This isn't natural. Look at this. He gestured wildly at the boundary between their properties. It's like your grass is, feeding on mine. Harold looked more closely at the property line and felt his stomach drop. Gerald was right. The boundary wasn't a clean line anymore. Harold's grass was creeping across it in thin tendrils, like green fingers reaching into Gerald's yard. Where those tendrils touched, Gerald's grass blackened and died within hours. I don't know what you're talking about, Harold said. But his voice lacked conviction. My wife is having nightmares, Gerald continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. She says she can hear things moving under our bedroom floor at night. Scratching sounds. Like something's trying to get in. Harold wanted to dismiss Gerald's concerns as paranoia, but he couldn't forget the sounds he'd heard in his own backyard, or the way his lawn had seemed to glow and move in the moonlight. That evening, Harold called the number Eddie had given him. It went straight to voicemail, a generic recording that didn't even mention Eddie's name. Harold left a message asking for a callback, but somehow he knew Eddie wouldn't respond. The situation escalated rapidly over the next few days. Gerald's lawn continued to deteriorate at an alarming rate, and the strange tendrils from Harold's yard grew bolder, reaching further into Gerald's property each night. Other neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Chen from across the street mentioned that her flower beds were struggling. The Johnsons reported that their vegetable garden was producing stunted, pale vegetables that tasted bitter and wrong. Harold's lawn, meanwhile, had achieved a level of perfection that was almost supernatural. The grass was so uniformly green and dense that it looked like artificial turf, but softer and more vibrant than any synthetic material could ever be. The geometric patterns were now clearly visible even in daylight, forming intricate mandalas and spirals that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. But the sounds were getting louder. Harold could hear them during the day now, a constant, subtle rustling that seemed to emanate from every square foot of his property. At night, the sounds intensified into what could only be described as a symphony of movement, as if thousands of creatures were conducting some elaborate underground dance. He tried to research Vermis magnificus online but found nothing. No scientific papers, no gardening articles, no mention of the species anywhere in the academic literature. It was as if Eddie and his miracle worms existed in some shadow realm beyond the reach of conventional knowledge. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in early August. Harold was awakened by screaming from next door, not Gerald's voice, but Marla's, high and terrified. He rushed to his window and saw lights blazing in the Hutchinson house, figures moving frantically behind the curtains. 20 minutes later, an ambulance arrived. Harold watched from his darkened bedroom as paramedics wheeled someone out on a stretcher. Marla, he assumed, though the figure was covered by a blanket. Gerald followed, still in his pajamas, his face pale and drawn. The next morning, Harold found Gerald sitting on his front steps, staring at his ruined lawn with hollow eyes. She's in the hospital, Gerald said without looking up. Nervous breakdown, they're calling it. But I know what really happened. Harold approached cautiously. Gerald, She was right about the sounds, Gerald continued. They weren't coming from under our floor. They were coming from your yard. And last night, she said she could see them through the bedroom window. Worms, Harold, but not normal worms. These were different, bigger, and they were watching her. Harold felt ice form in his stomach. That's impossible. Is it? Gerald finally looked at him, and Harold was shocked by the haunted expression in his neighbor's eyes. Look at your lawn, Harold. Really look at it. Tell me that's natural. Harold turned to examine his property with fresh eyes, trying to see it as Gerald did. The grass was indeed too perfect, too uniform, too vibrantly green. The geometric patterns weren't random. They were too complex, too purposeful. And now that he was really paying attention, he could see subtle movements beneath the surface, like something large shifting just out of sight. "I'm moving," Gerald said quietly. "Putting the house on the market tomorrow. I can't. We can't stay here anymore." That night, Harold couldn't bring himself to go to bed. He sat in his kitchen with all the lights on, drinking coffee and staring out at his lawn. In the darkness, the geometric patterns were glowing again, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed almost like a heartbeat. The rustling sounds had evolved into something more complex, not just movement, but communication. The worms were talking to each other. Around 3 a.m., Harold saw something that made him drop his coffee mug. A section of his lawn near the property line was bulging upward, as if something large was pushing up from below. The bulge moved slowly across the yard, leaving a raised trail in its wake. Then another bulge appeared, and another, until his entire lawn was alive with underground movement. Harold grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, driven by a mixture of horror and fascination. Up close, the sounds were overwhelming, a constant chorus of rustling, sliding, and what could only be described as whispering. The grass beneath his feet felt spongy and warm, as if he were walking on living tissue rather than soil. He knelt down and parted the grass with his hands, shining the flashlight into the gap. What he saw made him recoil in terror. It wasn't soil at all anymore. It was a writhing mass of pale, segmented bodies, each one easily the size of a garden snake but with an intelligence that was unmistakably alien. Their skin had a translucent quality that revealed complex internal structures, not the simple digestive tract of an earthworm, but intricate networks of what looked like neural pathways pulsing with faint bioluminescence. Harold stumbled backward, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the lawn. Everywhere the light touched, he could see the same thing. His entire yard had been transformed into a living colony of these creatures. They moved with purpose, weaving in and out of each other in patterns that matched the geometric designs visible on the surface. One of the creatures near his feet raised what Harold assumed was its head, though it was difficult to tell which end was which. Along its length, tiny eye-like structures opened and closed in sequence, each one reflecting his flashlight beam like a star. The thing regarded him with what seemed like curiosity rather than hostility, tilting its elongated body as if trying to get a better look at him. Harold's rational mind tried to process what he was seeing. These weren't earthworms, they were something else entirely, something that had been masquerading as a soil amendment. Eddie had known exactly what he was selling, and Harold had been too desperate, too consumed with lawn envy, to ask the right questions. The creature watching him made a sound, not the rustling Harold had been hearing, but something more complex, a series of clicks and whistles that seemed almost like language. Other creatures nearby responded with similar sounds, and soon Harold was surrounded by what could only be described as a conversation conducted in an alien tongue. He backed toward his house, never taking his eyes off the writhing mass beneath his feet. The creatures didn't follow him, but he could feel them watching, their countless eye spots tracking his movement. When he reached his back door, Harold turned and ran inside, slamming the door behind him and throwing the deadbolt. Harold spent the rest of the night researching, his laptop screen the only light in his darkened kitchen. He searched for any mention of Eddie, Earth Whisperer 47, or unusual worm species. He found nothing concrete, but he did discover several forum posts from other users describing similar experiences. Lawns that became too perfect, neighbors who moved away suddenly, strange sounds and movements in the night. One post, dated 3 years earlier, caught his attention. Day 47 since application. The lawn is beautiful, but something's wrong. My neighbor's dog went missing last week. Found it this morning buried under my grass, but it wasn't dead. It was changed, covered in those things. They were inside it, moving under its skin. Had to put it down. Moving out tomorrow. Don't trust Eddie. Don't trust the worms. Harold's blood ran cold. He thought about Gerald's wife in the hospital, about the other neighbors' struggling gardens, about the way his perfect lawn seemed to be expanding its influence beyond his property lines. As dawn broke, Harold made a decision. He had to get rid of them. He started with poison, industrial-strength pesticides that he'd never normally consider using. He sprayed his entire lawn, soaking the grass until it was dripping with chemicals. The creature's response was immediate and unsettling. The rustling sounds intensified into what could only be described as screaming, high-pitched, anguished cries that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But they didn't die. If anything, the chemicals seemed to energize them. Harold watched in horror as his lawn began to bubble and churn, the creatures rising closer to the surface in their agitation. The geometric patterns glowed brighter, pulsing with an angry red light that was visible even in daylight. Next, he tried fire. Harold doused sections of his lawn with gasoline and set them ablaze, hoping to burn out the infestation. The grass caught fire readily enough, but beneath the flames, Harold could see the creatures burrowing deeper, their bioluminescent bodies creating an eerie light show beneath the burning surface. When the fires died out, the grass grew back within hours, lusher and more vibrant than before. Desperate, Harold rented a rototiller and began tearing up his lawn, churning the soil to expose the creatures to air and sunlight. This approach seemed more promising. The creatures writhed and twisted when exposed, their translucent skin darkening and becoming brittle. But there were so many of them, and they moved so quickly, that Harold could only expose a small fraction at a time. As he worked, Harold became aware that he was being watched, not just by the creatures, but by his neighbors. Mrs. Chen stood at her window, her face pale with concern. The Johnsons had gathered on their front porch, whispering among themselves and pointing at Harold's destroyed lawn. Even the mailman had stopped his route to stare at the chaos Harold was creating. By evening, Harold had managed to till up about half his front yard, leaving behind a moonscape of churned earth and writhing creatures. His clothes were soaked with sweat and covered in a strange, oily substance that the creatures seemed to secrete when disturbed. His hands were raw and blistered, and every muscle in his body ached. But the creatures were adapting. Harold could see them learning from his attacks, developing new strategies. They began burrowing deeper when they sensed the rototiller approaching. They started moving in coordinated groups, overwhelming his efforts to expose them. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to be communicating with creatures beyond his property. Harold could see similar disturbances beginning in other yards throughout the neighborhood. That night, Harold's phone rang. The caller ID showed Gerald's number. "Harold?" Gerald's voice was strained, exhausted. "I'm at the hospital with Marla. The doctors say she's stable, but, Harold, she's been talking about your lawn. She says the creatures are spreading. She says they're not just in your yard anymore." Harold looked out his kitchen window at the devastation he'd created. In the moonlight, he could see the creatures moving through the churned earth like pale serpents, their bioluminescent patterns creating a light show that was both beautiful and terrifying. "Gerald, I'm trying to get rid of them. I've been working all day." "You don't understand," Gerald interrupted. "Marla says they're not just worms. She says they're scouts, the first wave of something bigger. And Harold, she says they've been calling to their homeworld." Harold felt the phone slip from his numb fingers. Outside, his ruined lawn pulsed with alien light, and in the distance, he could hear answering pulses from yards throughout the neighborhood. The geometric patterns weren't random. They were a signal, a beacon calling across the vast darkness of space. As Harold watched, a new sound joined the chorus of rustling and clicking that had become the soundtrack of his nights. It was deeper, more resonant, coming from somewhere far above. Harold stepped outside and looked up at the star-filled sky, searching for the source of the sound. There, barely visible against the darkness, something was moving among the stars. Something large, and getting closer. Harold realized with growing horror that his quest for the perfect lawn had been nothing more than a recruitment drive. Eddie hadn't been selling him worms. He'd been selling him an invasion force. And Harold, in his petty jealousy and desperate need to outdo his neighbor, had given them exactly what they needed: a foothold on Earth. The sound from above grew louder, and Harold could see lights beginning to descend through the atmosphere. Slowly, deliberately, like falling stars that had forgotten how to burn out. Harold stood transfixed in his ruined yard, watching as the alien vessels, for that's what they had to be, broke through Earth's atmosphere with barely a whisper. They were massive, organic-looking things that seemed to pulse with the same bioluminescent patterns as the creatures writhing beneath his feet. The first ship touched down in the park 3 blocks away, its landing so gentle it barely disturbed the trees. Others followed, settling into empty lots, parking areas, and open fields throughout the city. Harold could see their lights dotting the horizon like a constellation that had fallen to Earth. The creatures in his yard responded immediately to their arrival. The rustling sounds intensified into what could only be described as celebration, a symphony of clicks, whistles, and harmonics that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The geometric patterns in Harold's lawn blazed brighter, and similar patterns began appearing in yards throughout the neighborhood as dormant colonies awakened. Harold's phone buzzed with emergency alerts. Unusual atmospheric phenomena reported citywide. Residents advised to remain indoors. But Harold couldn't move. He was mesmerized by the sight of his lawn transforming before his eyes. The creatures were emerging now, no longer hiding beneath the grass. They rose from the earth like pale ribbons, their translucent bodies catching and reflecting the light from the ships above. But they weren't the same simple worm-like beings Harold had first glimpsed. They were changing, evolving, revealing their true forms. Some grew larger, developing complex appendages and sensory organs. Others seemed to merge together, forming collective entities that moved with singular purpose. The most disturbing transformation was happening to the creatures that had been feeding on the neighboring properties. They were taking on characteristics of what they had consumed. Harold could see grass-like filaments growing from their bodies, and in the distance, near where the Johnsons' vegetable garden had been, creatures that bore an unsettling resemblance to corrupted plants. A new sound cut through the alien chorus, human voices, screaming and shouting from houses throughout the neighborhood. Harold could see lights coming on in windows, people running from their homes, cars starting up and speeding away into the night. But not everyone was fleeing. Some of his neighbors stood in their yards like Harold, watching the transformation with expressions of wonder rather than terror. Mrs. Chen emerged from her house, but something was wrong with her movements. She walked with the same fluid, purposeful gait as the creatures, and when she turned toward Harold, her eyes reflected the bioluminescent patterns of the alien colony. She wasn't alone. Harold could see other neighbors moving through the streets with the same eerie coordination, as if they were being guided by some external intelligence. The realization hit Harold like a physical blow. The creatures hadn't just been transforming the lawns. They had been transforming the people too, slowly and subtly, through some form of biological contamination. Everyone who had been exposed to the expanding colonies, everyone who had breathed the spores or touched the infected soil, was becoming part of the collective. Harold looked down at his hands, still stained with the oily secretions from his day of futile resistance. His skin tingled with a warmth that seemed to spread up his arms and into his chest. He could feel something changing inside him, a growing awareness of the collective consciousness that connected all the creatures in his yard. It wasn't unpleasant. In fact, it was remarkably peaceful, like finally understanding a language he'd been hearing all his life without comprehension. The creatures weren't invaders in the traditional sense. They were gardeners, cultivators of biological diversity. They traveled from world to world, seeding new forms of life and consciousness, creating hybrid ecosystems that bridged the gap between species and planets. Harold's obsession with his lawn, his desperate need for perfection, had made him the ideal candidate for their first contact. They had given him exactly what he wanted, the most beautiful lawn in the neighborhood, while slowly preparing him and his community for integration into their larger purpose. As the transformation progressed, Harold found he could understand the creatures' communications. They were sharing memories, experiences from dozens of worlds where they had successfully established colonies. Each world was different, each species unique, but the pattern was always the same. Initial resistance followed by gradual acceptance as the benefits of integration became clear. The ships in the distance were opening now, revealing vast gardens filled with hybrid life forms from across the galaxy. Harold could see trees that bore fruit from multiple worlds, flowers that sang in harmonious frequencies, grass that grew in living mandalas of impossible beauty. This was what Earth could become. Not conquered or destroyed, but elevated, transformed into something greater than the sum of its parts. Harold felt his consciousness expanding, connecting not just with the creatures in his yard but with the growing network of transformed humans throughout the city. Gerald's wife Marla was there, her mind clear and peaceful now that she understood what was happening. Gerald himself was resisting, his fear creating static in the collective consciousness, but even he would come to understand eventually. The last thing Harold experienced as his individual consciousness merged with the collective was a sense of profound irony. He had started this journey because he was jealous of his neighbor's perfect lawn. Now, the entire planet would have perfect lawns, perfect everything, as humanity joined the galactic community of cultivated worlds. In the morning, when the emergency response teams finally arrived, they found the neighborhood transformed. Every lawn was perfect, every garden a masterpiece of biological artistry. The residents moved with calm purpose, tending to plants and creatures that defied earthly classification. They spoke in harmonious tones about the beauty of integration, the joy of collective consciousness, the privilege of joining something larger than themselves. The ships had departed, but they had left behind the seeds of transformation. Within a year, the phenomenon had spread to every continent. Within a decade, Earth had become the newest garden world in a vast galactic network of cultivated planets. And in what had once been Harold Pemberton's front yard, a small plaque grew from the living grass itself, its bioluminescent letters telling the story of the man whose lawn envy had opened the door to humanity's greatest transformation. Visitors from across the galaxy would come to see it, marveling at how such a small, petty emotion had led to such a magnificent outcome. The plaque simply read, "Here began the cultivation of Earth, through the perfect lawn of Harold Pemberton, who wanted nothing more than to outdo his neighbor."